Biden-Harris or Harris-Biden, however you're going to put it, administration, you could put in things like Obamacare as a classic example of that. How difficult has it been to rectify all of the failures and so forth of Obamacare? We're still trying to dig our way out from under that. And these people, with their legislative program at least, look much more aggressive than Obama did. Obama talked about fundamentally changing the country. He changed a lot of things, but not to the degree that the Harris-Biden group says they're going to do it.
Right, right. I mean, it's kind of like the frosting on the cake, and we see how deep the deep state is right now. Look how much worse it's going to be if we've got another 4 years of people that openly admit that they are socialists and Marxists and believe in all this stuff that we don't believe in.
No, that's right.
And totally antithetical to our Constitution.
That's right. Well, that's the interesting point here, that nobody seems to be saying, wait a minute, these policies are unconstitutional. It's not simply that Biden and Harris maybe aren't the best politicians we can get in, but they're proposing things that are fundamentally contrary, not only to the Constitution. When we start talking about globalism, you're talking about the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
The so-called free and independent states that made this declaration. Free and independent of what? Of all other states around the world, including Britain. Right? And now they're attempting to reverse the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
So we're talking about fundamental. Obama had no idea of how fundamental the fundamental change could be. But the people behind this Democratic group, they certainly understand what it is.
They do. And we're talking in such a total scale that in reality, it's very likely that we won't even have a constitution at the end of 4 years. Certainly not anything close to what the founders envisioned.
Well, you have a piece of paper called the Constitution, and then you'll have the real world, the real political world, which will be entirely different. And you look at it from the point of view of the election. We have a Constitution that has all sorts of checks and balances built into it all the way down to the state and local level, because they're part of it in the federal system, supposedly to give us honest elections. And what's happened? Half of the country saying, forget it, we don't worry about fraud. The guy was elected, that's the end of it, live with it. And the other half of the country, say this is a fundamentally fraudulent election. The person who was supposedly elected is not legitimate. What greater split in the country could you possibly have?
Absolutely.
And that's under the Constitution we have now. There's been no change in the Constitution. No one has even said, other than the Electoral College, that all the provisions of the Constitution or at the state level are somehow out of date. They don't like the Electoral College, but that's another reason. So they're supposedly saying, well, we're following the Constitution, and yet what do we see? We see something that's entirely antithetical to the Constitution. So if they'll do it at that level, at what level will they stop?
I don't think they will, and that's kind of the tragedy of this whole thing, is the fact that they keep getting away with it. They're going to do everything they fully intend to do without much resistance to it.
So that's the key. Yeah.
I think you're at a point right now in this country, and I was going to ask you this question. I think they're doing this intentionally. I think they want to start a civil war in our country. I think they're doing it to see how far they can go and see if once we start to fight back. I think they're fully intending to, under a new administration, to make patriots in this country the enemy of the state. Well,
I think so, because if you look at some of the things that Hillary Clinton said about the deplorables, as a classic example, look at some of the things that the media nabobs have been saying about us. The idea that it was AOC, they were going to have proscription lists. She didn't call it proscription, a list. We're going to have lists of people who had been supportive of Trump or Trump's ideology or Trump's political movement, and things were supposed to happen to them.
Right.
That's the Roman proscription list. A Roman proscription list, they put the list of the people, and those were the ones who were going to be killed or exiled. Well, they can't quite get away with that yet. But they're already talking that way.
They're talking that way.
How can you live in a republic in which one group can gain political power and then essentially bastardize the other group, legally speaking and socially speaking? And they're already talking that way.
Well, they're talking that way, and they're talking things like re-education camps. I mean, that's straight out of the Soviet Union. That's straight out of communist China.
Communist China. Communist China does an even better job than Stalin ever did. Yeah. Stalin wasn't interested in re-education. He was interested in working people to death and punishing them. The communist Chinese are interested in brainwashing. Even Mao admitted that. There's an interesting book about where at one point someone was talking. He said, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. It's brainwashing. That's the right word. We're changing their perceptions and the way they think, so they can only think in line with the party, with the Communist Party.
Right.
And look, you go back to Lenin, you go back to the classic Bolsheviks, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, all that. This was part of that philosophy. People had to think along the lines of the party. They called it in Russian partynost. Thinking along the lines of the party. If you didn't think along the lines of the party, you were an outlier in society, and something was going to happen to you that you didn't like.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the goal.
Well, I guess Thumper, we ought to put our speakers' books up. I have to say that. We have quite a author, quite a writer in our midst right now. Edwin, you've done books for the last, 30 years, 25 years?
Yeah, probably at least. Sure.
Yeah. Let's put that list of books up there, and let's see if we can kind of advertise some of the things that you've been involved with.
I'll get them up there on the screen for everybody. I've got them ready to go here. It's just been.
Well, I can just tell you. I mean, many years ago, I wrote a book. Oh, way back in 1983 with the Gold Commission. I wrote a book called Pieces of Eight, which is actually a short version, which was done at the request of Ron Paul to deal with the constitutional history and theory of money and banking. And then expanded that. That's no longer in print, but expanded that in 2000 into a big 2-volume set called Pieces of Eight. There it is right there. That one is also out of print, but that's kind of the ultimate. It's 1,700 and something pages long. It goes all the way from the colonial period through the time the book was written, and dealing primarily with the Federal Reserve System. That's a capstone of the banking problem. And then the constitutional monetary system. That's a hard book for people to read, but if you're really interested in this fundamental problem, and money and banking are fundamental economic problems which drive a great deal of our society, and people don't realize how important, how fundamental, and sometimes insidious they are. That's a good book. Then I became involved in writing about the constitutional militia. And I'm not talking about people running around the woods with camouflage outfits with, AR rifles playing soldier. I'm talking about the constitutional militia, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 15 and 16. This was the beginning of it. This was the first one. And the point of this was, we don't have what the Constitution requires us to have. What can people do at the local level to bring about what I call revitalization of this system? Because the system involves the people directly. The people are the militia. And the point of this was to give an overview and then to suggest what people could do at the local level to begin thinking about what needed to be done in changing their state statutes, because the militia in our system is really state-based. Constitution, in fact, calls them the militia of the several states. There's one in each of the 50 states. So this was the beginning. Get an idea of what the overview is. Here's some things you could do locally. You can begin to talk among yourselves. You can begin to come up with some ideas. Eventually, this thing works in a pyramidal way, and you get back to your state legislature and cause the state legislature to make some fundamental changes in the statutes that they have. Then I produced a really definitive work called Sword and Sovereignty, which
we have that,
which lays out, as it says, the constitutional principles. What does the Constitution really provide? And this book goes back into colonial history because if you look at the Constitution, that term militia of the several states refers to these entities, these establishments, which actually existed in the 13 states, 13 colonies in the 13 states at the time the Constitution was written. So that's the reference. It's to these real things that are really out there. And you can find that as well in the Articles of Confederation. So it's not something that was really new in the Constitution. And so this book goes back and says, well, what were these things? What were the constitutional principles that define these entities? And I go back and I take two states, Rhode Island and Virginia, for reasons that are laid out in the book, primarily because they were really kind of antipodal states. Rhode Island was a highly Republican state, was considered by many to be almost anarchic in its politics, and Virginia was really a traditional state that was run to a large extent by an economic and political elite. So I use those two as examples, go through all of the militia statutes and statutes related to the militia that were ever written in those two states. Oh, and by the way, if you look at all the other states, all the other colonies, the statutes are essentially all the same. And I derive from these, quoting them again and again and again and again, so somebody doesn't have to take my word for it, what these principles are. And then I apply those principles to what we have today, Second Amendment particularly, because people are interested in that for other reasons, because they want to keep their guns, and to the political structure of the country, and essentially say, look, we have a problem. We're in violation on many levels of these principles, and that is serious because if you look at, let's take Virginia, and let's take the Second Amendment. Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's the constitutional relationship that's recognized. You want a free state, you want to have a well-regulated militia, because the well-regulated militia is composed of whom? The people themselves, the ones who have the greatest interest and the greatest ability to preserve their free state. Same with Virginia. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, necessary, and safe defense of a free state. Same principle, right? Do we have that? The answer is no, we don't. We have the National Guard, actually an adjunct of the Army. People call it the organized militia. It's no more. It's not a militia. If you look at the history of it, it's a completely different situation. And as far as the real militia, they don't exist anywhere. Virginia, as I said, everyone from 16 to 55 is a member of the unorganized militia. What does the unorganized militia do? Essentially nothing. Has no training, no arms, no nothing. If there were a vast emergency, the statute says, well, the governor could call them out. Well, that'd be a little late to call them out because there's nothing they could actually do in such an emergency.
How can they enforce that, Edwin? How can they make that happen? Is that
it's going to have to come from the people who have the primary interest in this. The reason that we don't have a proper militia was at the turn of the 20th century, the deep state people of that time said, well, we don't need and we really don't want a militia. We don't want the people to become too involved in the running of their own government. See, the militia is a governmental entity. It's not a private group. It's a part of the government of each state.
Right.
And these people at the turn of the 20th century, they believed in the administrative state concept that you can't really run a big country with the people electing a few representatives to Congress. The people don't know what they're talking about. The few representatives tend not to be experts. What we need to do is to have Congress create so-called administrative agencies made up of experts for each important field of endeavor in which the government is going to be involved. And Congress will create these things, it will fund them, and that will be its purpose. The agencies will actually run the country, and the sole purpose of the people will be to elect appropriate individuals to Congress to fund this agency structure. And we see what's happened. It began with Wilson in the First World War. It was extended by Roosevelt during his 4 terms in office and the Second World War. And it's grown and grown and grown to the point at which you have, as a classic example right now, you have Anthony Fauci, who's a bureaucrat. And he is essentially telling the President of the United States what to do. Okay.
And telling most of the country that they need to wear masks, even though he's even contradicting himself.
Yeah. So you look at that, you say, okay, so now we have in the realm of medical science, public health. We have bureaucratic control of the country and forget the constitutional limitations. Right? We're not going to worry about that because these experts have told us what needs to be done. Now, of course, there are other experts who say the exact opposite, and some of these experts, like Fauci, has also said the exact opposite, right? But they're there, they're in that position, the administrative state controls, and the courts defer to them, the Congress keeps funding them, and even the President of the United States seems to be willing to bend over backwards for them. Now, 13 words is directed towards primarily those people in the Second Amendment community, people who like the Second Amendment, because they always focus on the last 14 words. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The first 18 words are a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And as a matter of English grammar and as a matter of constitutional law, you can't take a sentence and just disregard half of it,
right,
and expect that you're talking sense. You're certainly not talking the intent of the person who wrote that sentence. So this book is designed to point out to these people, wait a minute, you will never get anywhere in the long run with this right to keep and bear arms concept unless you tie it, as the Second Amendment does, as Article 1, Section 13 of the Virginia Constitution, as the Maryland Constitution. I can go through all of the original states. They still have this somewhere. You tie that right to keep and bear arms to its ultimate purpose, so that the people themselves are part of these militia structures which perform the function of providing the ultimate security to the free state. You can't have a free state unless you have security. You can't have security according to the Constitution unless you have a well-regulated militia. And you can't have a well-regulated militia unless the people themselves possess and are trained arms and in many other ways. All right? These all tie together. And what we have left, what even the Second Amendment proponents have allowed to happen, is to cut off all reference in what they do to those first 13 words.
Well, you know, we wouldn't have had Chaz, and we wouldn't have had Portland. We wouldn't have had all of these riots because they would not have been allowed to even get to that point had we had a militia as the founding fathers had designed into the Constitution.
And you wouldn't have had this electoral fraud either.
No.
No, because at the local level in all these places, there would have been direct militia involvement in the counting of the votes.
Yes.
All right? This wouldn't have happened. So that's what this book is. It's fairly short, but it's designed to get those people whom I think they're acting in good faith. They're just not informed. They need to take a broader perspective, get a broader perspective on this issue. Then I wrote another book called Three Rights, which ties all this together. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and particularly the militia concept. Because if you look at the Declaration of Independence, what does it say? At a certain point in time, the people who have all authority to create government sometimes have to take control of the government back into their own hands. That was the point, right? It gets out of hand. They can alter it, they can abolish it, they can do things incrementally. At some point, it gets so bad they have to take these powers back into their own hands. And they did that originally in 1776, and then they gave us the Constitution, and they gave us these provisions in the Constitution for us to be, us the people, to be able to do this ourselves, not only under a kind of an emergency situation, but normally. We should have involvement of the people through the militia normally. Right? And Three Rights is supposed to point that out. It talks about the right of restoration, the right of review, essentially, of situations, and ultimately the right of what's called the right of revolution. Now, I don't call it the right of revolution because it's really a restorative process. We're not, any change that would be made at that level would not be revolutionary. It would be restorative. You'd be going back to first principles.
Exactly.
But it tries to tie it all together and say, wait a minute, you can't look at the Declaration of Independence as being somehow separate from the Constitution, and you can't look at the Constitution, the body of the Constitution, somehow being separate from this militia concept. They're all tied together through what? The people. The people are the things that are reiterated again and again and again in these documents. So that's a short book that tries to tie it all together. And then, because it's been since 9/11 and all the legislation that came out, this concept of martial law and the involvement of the military somehow in the government of the country, what would be called in South American countries the golpe, the military coup.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I read a book called The Bastardy of Martial Law.
Mm-hmm.
All right. From tyranny out of necessity. That is, tyranny is born from necessity. Typically, that's the argument that's always made. We need to have tyrannical powers because there's some emergency necessity facing us. And this is always the reason for martial law situations. There's some extreme situation we can't handle under the normal political process, legal process, so we have to turn it over to the military people, and martial law is essentially the ultimate of tyranny. It's whatever the military people say goes. Political power comes out of the barrel of a gun, as Mao Zedong would say. All right? Most dangerous concept there is in politics. And I go through the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution of the United States, and show that martial law, as it's generally understood by people, is legally impossible in this country. And that anyone who proposes that is an extraordinary danger to our survival. Except in one respect. And if you think of martial law in a kind of dictionary sense of armed people enforcing the law, there is a kind of martial law in that sense in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Congress shall have the power to call forth the militia. And what's the first reason for calling forth the militia? To execute the laws of the United States. Okay, and that's the people. Congress could call forth the people themselves to execute their own laws. And this is the same in Virginia, and you can look in many other states and you'll find that same type of structure, right? Usually fleshed out a little more because they'll have the statutory requirements for the governor or whatever. So yes, you can imagine a situation constitutionally where execution of the laws would be to a large extent put into the hands of the militia. And I give you an example of the election process. If you had a constitutional militia, you would have militia units, small units. They'd be companies, 50 to 100 people, spread out all across, let's say, your precinct, your voting area. And all those people would be registered as members of the militia. You'd know who they were. And they would all come in, and they'd be on the list, and they'd get their secret ballot. And their secret ballot would have a serial number on it so we could trace this thing back. And they would mark their ballot there at the polling place, and they would turn that over. And some other militia people would come in and count those ballots and make sure that it was only registered voters who had received them, members of the militia, registered voters who had received them, that they had the right number, that these were on the right paper and so forth and so on, and that the count was right. And then they would put up in your militia unit all the serial numbers of these ballots with indications of what the votes were. So I could come back to that precinct headquarters, that militia headquarters, and I could look up and I'd say, oh, there I am. I'm 162957. That's right. I voted for Jones. I voted for Smith. I voted against referendum issue number 2. All right? There'd be an exact check. There'd be control from beginning to end. You would never have, again, the possibility of widespread electoral fraud. Now, you might imagine that, a small area here, one company or something, you could get fraud, all right? But that would quickly be discovered. You couldn't get everybody on board to falsify votes, even in that small group of 100 people. Very, very unlikely. So that's one of the ways that the militia would execute the laws. Another way would be, assuming that you have administrative agencies that were performing some valid function, and that function had to be executed at the state and local level. Instead of having SWAT teams coming out of the Department of Interior to enforce laws about public parks, the execution of those laws would be delegated to the local militia people. And you would never have a Bundy Ranch situation. That would never
Exactly.
occur. All right?
Exactly.
So to the extent those administrative agencies were performing a constitutional function, the militia would execute that function at the local level with consideration of local situations, local personalities. And then to the extent that the agencies were sending down regulations that were unconstitutional, what would happen? The militia would say, stuff it.
Yeah,
We're not doing this. We're not doing this. No way. Okay. So you'd have an extra control on the administrative agency process.
Well, in a situation like what we're having in Michigan, or any one of the other states where we have these governors, handing out these unconstitutional edicts under a false, I'm going to call it a false flag of pandemic BS that's going on. These people are absolutely operating in violation of my, in the state of Washington, it makes it very, very clear that we have an individual right. Our individual rights are written into specifically in those words into our state constitution. Mm-hmm. It was the words that Inslee used when he made the first announcement. When he was asked, "Why aren't you wearing a mask?" And he said, "Well, I'm exercising my individual right." And bastard.
Is that the same? Yeah, is that the same Inslee that told everybody they had to forget about Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's that pushback concept in any system of our kind, federal system. It's like the rubber bands, right? One rubber band pulls this way, the other rubber band pulls that way. You get some kind of political equilibrium, and they've removed that element of political equilibrium or the mechanism that brings it about by taking the people out of this position. Mm-hmm. So the average person no longer thinks that he has this kind of authority. In fact, the average person that I run into in Virginia, and I ever get into a discussion of this kind, I'll ask the question, "Are you a member of a militia?" And the average person will say, "Oh, no," they'll recoil in horror and say, "No, I don't belong to a group like that, running around the woods, with guns." And I say, "Well, of course you do. You're enrolled in the Virginia militia. You're between 16 and 55. You're able-bodied, and so you're not a member of the National Guard. You're a member of the militia. It's automatic." "Oh, I didn't know that." "Really?" Now, if you didn't know that, then you certainly don't know a lot more about this problem. So in this book called By Tyranny Out of Necessity, at the end of the book, it says, look, we can't have anything like martial law. You can't have the military involved in this. These situations have to be put in the hands of the militia. And actually, the big point is all of the police functions that we now have. Oh, that's another one. I'll get to that one in a second. All of the police functions have to be put in the hands of the militia. And then we won't have any more problems of police brutality, police corruption, police incompetence, because the people themselves will be directly in control of the police who are policing their local areas. So under those circumstances, all of these problems of discrimination and so forth tend to disappear very quickly. This is, again, a long book. This is about 700 pages long. It's not some small thing. But it treats a major problem. The other one that you had up there was the imperial judiciary. And that gets to the question of who is in charge of our Constitution. Is it simply 5 people on the Supreme Court of the United States? Or is there some other interpretation? And what happens when these 5 people on the Supreme Court get completely out of line in terms of constitutional law? And that's what we see today. We saw it more, I suppose, in not particularly this court, but we saw it with the Warren Court. It's a classic example of the imperial judiciary. They thought they could get away with anything because they had the big enough majority. And there's one case, Cooper versus Aaron, that was written by Justice Brennan. Well, he comes out and he says it. He says the Constitution, the supreme law of the land is the decision of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution. That's an interesting circle.
No kidding.
The Supreme Court get the power to interpret the Constitution such that its determinations became the Constitution. See, this is illogic. Mm-hmm. These people say any damn thing they want once they get to the levels of power, right? And so the question is, how could that be possible? How in a Republican form of government where the people are in control, could individuals who are appointed during good behavior, they say during life, but isn't during life, the Constitution doesn't provide that, during good behavior, who are very difficult to remove, that they can say anything they want and the rest of the country has to swallow that? Now, of course, that's in violation of the first principle of litigation, which is court decisions apply only to the parties before the court. So if between Smith and Jones, the Supreme Court says, oh, well, the Constitution provision here means such and such, and Smith wins, well, between Abel and Baker, that's not binding. simply because it's Abel and Baker. It could also be because the Supreme Court was wrong in the Smith versus Jones case. And I'll give you an example from my own history. I brought a case in 1977 involving the authority of public sector unions to require non-members to pay them union dues. And there were essentially two parts to that case. I won't get into the details. I won the first part. I lost the second part. 41 years later, the Supreme Court had another group of plaintiffs and defendants, different group of plaintiffs and defendants, raising the same question, the one I supposedly lost. The Supreme Court then said, oh, that earlier decision was completely wrong. But nothing in that was right. It was wrong on every point. And so what I had said 41 years later was vindicated. All right? Now, ask yourself this question. When was the Supreme Court right? Was it right the first time? Was it right the second time and wrong the first time? Or was it wrong both times? I'm perfectly willing to say it was wrong the first time and right the second time, but you see the problem you get into.
Sure.
If they can be right and they can be wrong and they can reverse themselves, the Constitution doesn't reverse itself.
Right.
Except by amendment. Okay? So we're talking about an inherently illogical, even ridiculous theory of judicial supremacy, which then puts handcuffs on Congress, the president, state legislatures, and so forth and so on, because whatever piece of idiocy comes out of the court, and now it's coming out of lower level courts because the lower level decisions don't always get to the Supreme Court to be considered. The Supreme Court takes a very small percentage of the cases that come up to it for review from the lower level courts. So in some places like the District of Columbia Circuit, which hears a lot of government cases, the District of Columbia Circuit is probably just as powerful as the Supreme Court, maybe more powerful, because in many instances it doesn't get a chance to be reversed. And it can say any bloody thing it wants. Well, that whole concept is contrary to the concept of a government that's actually run by the people. It's run by this oligarchy now, and there's no way to control them. Well, actually, I give a number of ways to control them if the political process, especially the legislatures, the executive, simply wanted to do it. They could do it. And that's what that book is all about. Goes into the irrationality of let me say, the excessiveness of the concept of judicial supremacy. Because, of course, there are some aspects in which, a decision is made against Smith in the Smith versus Jones case. That's it. Smith has no other recourse. There's no higher appeal. He's stuck. It may be wrong, but he's stuck. So there's judicial supremacy in that area because there's no way you can control it in that area. But this concept that they can rule something in Smith versus Jones and that then binds me and you and everyone else in the universe, for that matter,
for eternity,
is idiocy. Okay? And until we come out and say the judiciary is not the controlling element. This is not the Khedive sitting under the tree. This is not the Council of Wise Men in the Acropolis in Athens. This is a bunch of fallible people, and there have to be checks and balances to control not only their mistakes, which they make all the time. Look at case Payne versus Tennessee. I think it's in volume 500 of the United States Code. Its first footnote lists cases that the Supreme Court has reversed, constitutional decisions it has reversed. And the footnote goes on for a whole page. And those are simply the ones, I think, in which they say that they're reversing an earlier decision. Many times they reverse an earlier decision, but say, well,
without saying it.
This one is out of, whatever. They'll give some shoddy explanation, but they won't actually reverse it. So they reverse themselves plenty of times, okay? We have to recognize that they can't be the only ones that can declare that they are in error. Otherwise, they control. We don't have a Republican form of government. We don't have separation of powers. They are the only power of consequence. We certainly don't have federalist system in which the states have some real control over their own destiny. Something has got to be done about that. So that's what that book is about. Now, if you tie all those things together, what do you get? You get the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, to be controlled by the people themselves, and no one particular branch to have this kind of absolute control.
Absolutely.
In which it can tell everybody else what to do, even in a situation where it doesn't have everybody else in front of it.
And yet at the same time, Edwin, it gives the president the power that if he sees these other groups coming in trying to destroy our Constitution and our Republic. It gives him the tools to be able to respond accordingly to stop that process.
Yeah, it was Hamilton. I don't like Hamilton because he was a centralizer.
Mm-hmm.
He was not
A central banker. Yeah.
Well, central bankers, the Treasury was going to be the central agency of the government, so it could be tied in with the financiers in New York. I mean, this guy had a concept that was, let me just say, at odds with the pure concept of federalism. Let's just leave it at that. But he did say one thing. He said, we have to have, what's the word? In the agency, we have to have an executive branch that can exercise authority. Mm-hmm. All right? The executive cannot be a figurehead here. And energy, I think it's energy in the executive. It's in the Federalist Papers. And he was right about that. There are some situations that occur in which a decision of a single person, not a committee like Congress or not a small body like the court system, a decision of a single person is necessary at that moment. Mm-hmm. We can't wait and come to the next session of Congress. We can't wait and go through 2 years of litigation before it gets to the Supreme Court for some decision. Something has to be done at that point in time. This is a classic example of what's going on right now. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, people are still playing into the old paradigm. Oh, we go to the legislature. Oh, we'll go to the courts. We'll work. And they don't stop and say, wait a minute. We have a critical situation which will be out of hand by the time it gets to the courts. The courts may very well fudge their decision because they're afraid of the consequences of overturning what has happened through the past 6 months. Mm-hmm. All right, and I give you the classic example of the Federal Reserve System. People have tried again and again and again to get certain central constitutional questions about the Federal Reserve System up to the courts, and the courts invariably do not they do not decide those cases on the merits. They find some avoidance technique so they don't have to decide them. That's their classical way of getting of not taking responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. We get around this by we'll use some technique. You don't have standing, it isn't ripe, whatever, political question, all sorts of ways that they've designed to do it. And one of those will always be used when they feel that they can't change the situation. Mm-hmm. And I've often said that about the Federal Reserve to people. I said, look, if you came to the Federal Reserve with a perfect constitutional case that showed the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional, and the court were to decide that, what would then happen?
Right.
Well, there would be chaos, right? There'd be chaos in the markets. There'd be chaos in Congress trying to figure out what to do. The court could not write an opinion saying what Congress should do. It could only write an opinion saying what Congress has done is unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. So I can understand why judges would say, oh my gosh, this is a case where if I decide it on the merits, all hell is going to break loose.
Yeah, Pandora's box is
box is going to be worse than Pandora's box, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And in this situation, we're looking at exactly that archetypical problem in the judicial system.
Well, what do you think of this, Edwin? And this is something that has been stated pretty openly. If in fact the Georgia Senate race ends up turning all three branches of government over to the liberal Democrats, and they go about court packing. I mean, the courts are bad enough the way they are, but our Supreme Court, if they get away with court packing, it's all over.
Well, it may be all over before they get to court packing.
True.
Because so many pieces of legislation, state or federal, never get to the Supreme Court. You know, if they're worried about Amy Coney Barrett there, she may never see those problems.
True.
Right? But of course, you do have to come. I mean, people are already up in arms about the electoral fraud. The thing that did terrific damage to Roosevelt, Franklin, was what? His court packing scheme. Remember that? Mm-hmm. There was a certain piece of legislation, National Industrial Recovery Act,
right,
another piece of legislation, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, you think of those, that he didn't get through that were keynote parts of his first administration of the New Deal. And it was because of the 5 old men on the Supreme Court. And so he came up with a court packing scheme. I think it involved retirement at a fixed age and then increase the number of justices, whatever. Even his own party turned against him. It wasn't just the Republicans. Even the Democrats, the old line Democrats, turned against him, and he had to back away because they realized if they put that thing through, they would undercut the legitimacy, not just of Roosevelt, but of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem here today is, I think your modern day Democrats, your contemporary Democrats, there are no Democrats, very few of the stature of the Democrats of the time of Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I don't think you're going to find many people stand up against a Harris-Biden administration in the way those Democrats, high-level Democrats, stood up against Franklin Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
And so they might get this court packing scheme in, and then you're right, because Constitution goes out the window if the court has the authority to tell you what the Constitution is, and it's going to rubber stamp every piece of legislation that comes out of Congress and the executive branch.
Right.
You're finished at that stage.
Mm-hmm. You are. And then, quite frankly, John Roberts has been an incredible disappointment, to say the least. And he's gone in many ways against the Constitution. So, we do have a problem already, in truth. And if this court packing scheme gets pushed through, we won't have a Constitution in any way, shape, or form.
No. Well, you'll have the dictates coming out of the Supreme Court, and if you believe that's a constitution,
Right.
is that, if you believe them, but you won't have a constitution in the sense that the framers gave us a constitution. You'll have this other thing.
This other thing.
Different. Yeah, other thing completely different. So that's a very scary proposition, and I'll wait and see if they dare do it. I think it's scary enough that if they have majorities in the Senate and the House, then the radicals will have no bridle whatsoever. That horse will be totally out of control because they'll be able to push through anything that they want. Unless, and once again, unless you can find some people in the Senate, Democrats, who would side with the Republicans because they fear the consequences of passing certain kinds of legislation. I don't think the Republicans have enough people, or there are enough Democrats, really, enough Democrats in the House to stop too much legislation. But there might be enough in the Senate. It's close enough, perhaps.
Well, and the thing is, we don't have any more Strom Thurmonds in the Democrat Party, because people forget he was a Dixiecrat before he became one of the more conservative Republicans.
Yeah,
that's the way the Democrat Party used to be.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So it's a completely different set of personalities and a completely different political agenda that these people are pushing. And they really are irresponsible. I mean, you look at some of the things that they're proposing and you say, how could a responsible individual propose it? The AOC, Green New Deal, $1 trillion a year over 10 years. Have they lost their minds? $10 trillion on this thing? Huh? Oh, well, no problem there. We'll have the Federal Reserve print it. They don't understand the consequence of runaway inflation. Right? Weimar Germany. What came after Weimar Germany, by the way?
Yeah, exactly. The Nazi Party. Yeah.
Let's remember some of the real problems. Well, there was the communists on the one side and the Nazis on the other. Nazis ended up winning. But you would have had, whichever one won, you would have had that kind of extreme radical government, right?
Exactly.
So that's what I find the worst about this. And Biden talks out of his both sides of his mouth. Harris, of course, talks out of both sides of her mouth. But behind them are the ones that are going to be pushing this agenda. Right? And I don't think Biden is a strong enough personality, even if I thought he was constitutionalist in some basic sense, that he's going to stand up to people in his party telling him that he's got to push the globalist agenda.
Oh, I think intellectually, there's no question in my mind that he wasn't all that sharp to begin with, and he's long past his better days.
Oh, yeah, well, leave that aside. Assume that isn't the problem. Assume that he isn't going to be removed under the 25th Amendment within the next 6 months, which I would not, I wouldn't bet a lot that wouldn't happen.
I won't either, yeah.
No, I mean, he definitely has some slowdown of acuity, if you will. So he could be removed. But leaving that all aside, I don't think those two personalities, of course, the vice president is a cipher initially, but certainly Biden as the president, I don't think that he has the the moral strength, personal moral strength, to stand up to these people, the radicals in the Democratic Party, who will be pushing him. And they'll be proposing their own legislation. They won't necessarily wait for him to propose the most radical legislation. They'll be turning. They probably are writing it right now.
Well, he's got a history of being bought and paid for, really since the very beginning. He even admitted when he was first a senator that don't look at me if you think that I'm not corrupt. Of course I am. I mean, he admitted it more or less. I'm paraphrasing, but. Yeah.
Well, he's an apparatchik. I mean, he goes along with the system. And what was it? Who was it that said this? Was it Tip O'Neill? To get along, you have to go along. I think that was his slogan, right?
As a matter of fact, I think he used that with Reagan.
Yeah, to get along, you have to go along, and that's the system in Congress, right? You want to get this, you got to go along with that, and the same with the president. He's got to go along with Congress, and the only check and balance on that is to have either a different party in control of the Congress as opposed to the presidency, or to have, if it's the same party, have a sufficient number of that party be willing to turn against the president's agenda if they think that it's dangerous. You've got to have a balance someplace.
Or more ideally, Edwin, to have no parties and have everybody run on their own merit.
Oh, well, if I were running for president, it would be on the platform of George Washington's farewell address. I say, I'm going to do everything George wanted. He's probably the only one we had that was a man of great integrity, honor, erudition, all of those things. And he wasn't corrupt in the sense that he wanted power. It had to be forced on him. He was like Cincinnatus, right? And here's what he told us. And we have deviated from every one of these principles. You think that's why we're in this septic tank going down for the third time? If we had only listened to George.
All right.
That was the first Marine Division. What was that slogan? Let George do it. Because they call themselves George. And said when every dirty job went to the first Marine Division, Guadalcanal, Chosin Reservoir, Peleliu, whatever it was, right? They got to let George do it. All right. And in a sense, that would be my slogan. Let's let George do it. He told us how to do it. We've deviated. We're suffering the consequences. Let's return to that. And in fact, that would be progress, as opposed to retrogression, because we're going forward in a sense. Well, we don't have that now. We're not going to get it unless, and I don't know that we're going to get it if Trump is retained, but we're certainly not going to get it if the Democrats end up in control of the presidency and the House and, heaven forfend, the courts. That would definitely be the death knell.
Yeah, it would. Well, I have to tell you, this has been a fascinating
my machine
discussion.
is telling me that the internet connection is unstable.
Well, it was for a second there, but you're coming through just fine now.
You've been solid all the whole time here, Edwin.
Yeah. Yeah,
I thought we were going to see something from CNN saying that this was dangerous information.
We will. It'll come through on YouTube and Facebook. I can guarantee you that it'll say, this is inappropriate information. Please beware. It's the way it works, Ed. When you get used to it after a while, we've been facing that all year. We had one show back in June, I think, wasn't it, Thumper, that we had like 1.15 million views on the thing, and they started banning and blacklisting us. So.
We kicked out a whole bunch of views on YouTube, and all of a sudden YouTube said, "Oh, that's too many. We're going to have to take this video down."
Yeah.
Yep.
It's been happening. Well, Edwin, I have to tell you, we were kind of holding it a little bit. You actually have gone almost 50 minutes beyond our normal time here, because Patrick Howley, our host who is doing the follow-up show, has been stuck halfway in traffic between the airport and home to be able to do his program. So if you're willing to stick with us for a few more minutes, I'd love to hear what you think would be important for I guess for the next 2 months, while Trump is still in as president, and let's assume that that they're going to figure out a way to steal the presidency away from him. What does he need to do in the next 2 months? What would be so important? And you're the only person I know that could hear that question and be able to think through an answer for it very quickly and very succinctly.
Well, number one, there's no new legislation he can put forward, obviously, because Congress, at least the House, is in control of the Democrats. That's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
He can write all the executive orders he wants, but unless in some way they're enforced immediately and have an immediate effect, if the Biden-Harris administration gets in, those executive orders will be rescinded. And the courts will not say, as they said with Trump, that he couldn't do it because, whatever Obama, that executive order that Obama passed. The court said that Trump couldn't rescind that, even though that executive order of Obama's was unconstitutional. The Biden-Harris administration won't have any problem rescinding whatever executive orders of Trump that they want. Thirdly, this problem of the electoral fraud will not be on its way to resolution.
Right.
The courts can very easily simply dismiss certain cases, and new Biden administration will stop any criminal investigations. That'll disappear, like a snowflake in Death Valley. So he has to get something going on the record in that area that makes it impossible for them to convince the American people that nothing bad happened. Mm-hmm. He may not be able to get it finished if he doesn't, quote unquote, win the election, but he has to have that investigatory material out front for the American people to show them you've been defrauded. Mm-hmm. And now you people have to figure out what you're going to do. And then the people have to figure out what to do. And I think a lot of that has to do with local and state level reconstruction, litigation. There's a whole series of things that can be done. And at this stage, I don't know what you can do at the federal level other than people trying to test any legislation that comes out of Congress or executive orders that are enforced from the new administration that have unconstitutional aspects to them.
Edwin, I got a question for you. How, I put out the word that, this corruption, this mess that we've got goes all the way down to the secretary at your water district, as just an example. They've got gatekeepers. A lot of them don't even really know that they are a gatekeeper, but there's I see it here in my own state, my own community, and it's really pretty scary because a lot of people just don't know where to go to get justice rolling, and quite honestly, your assessment about our militia and how it should be working would have fixed this a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's like the case I had 41 years ago. All right. One aspect of that case, pointed out, this is the part that I, quote unquote, lost. We're telling the Supreme Court that if they allowed this public sector union operation to continue, they would very quickly see that the unions and the local administrators, because these were public sector unions that dealt with local bodies like school boards, the unions would have their negotiators on both sides of the bargaining table, because the unions were the ones that were electing these local officials. And as a result, arrangements would be negotiated with big pension funds and everything else, pie in the sky stuff. And in the long run, this would destabilize and perhaps fundamentally result in the bankruptcy of at least local governments and maybe higher up. And at that time, there was concern among a lot of economists were looking at this saying, wait a minute, they can't put this system in. This isn't like bargaining in the private sector where the consumer can walk away, where the company can move and so forth. You've got a fixed system in which the taxpayers are on the hook for whatever these unions negotiate. So they have them trapped and they'll milk them. The taxpayers generally can't leave. So this will have a bad result as soon as the political equilibrium breaks down and the unions are able to control both sides of the bargaining table, which is always true in the big cities. Okay? And the teachers' unions, that was the defendant in this case, one of the teachers' unions, they're one of the big, if not the big political power, union powers in those jurisdictions.
Right.
So it said to the Supreme Court, this is a problem. If you let them have this authority, this is going to happen. Supreme Court said, we're not going to worry about that. Let them have that authority. 41 years later, Supreme Court, same issue, said, no, we're not going to let them have that. That was wrong. That was wrong 41 years ago. Of course, in those 41 years, what happened to municipal finance? Right? It was undermined.
Went down the crapper.
Destroyed by what? To a large extent, public sector unionism. All right? So I was absolutely right 41 years ago, and it wasn't worth anything because, as even the Supreme Court itself said in the later decision, well, that's water over the dam. It's had a lot of bad effects, water over the dam, but they were wrong then, and we're right now, and we're going to change it. Okay? And so this is the grave difficulty. We can be absolutely right now and fail. And 10 years from now, it can turn out, hey, we were right, and people accept that. And in those 10 years, that's the thing that worries me about this. We're getting to the stage that's moving so fast that irreversible damage can happen very quickly. We don't have to wait for 10 years of a Biden administration, 12 years, 8 years of a Biden administration. We could have 1 year of a Biden administration, and the irreversible damage occurs because of the legislation they put in.
Well, especially if we start playing the wild card of globalism and global government and ceding a lot of our power as a nation over to global technocrats and administrators. It could be horrific. A year could be like a light year.
Well,
yeah.
I think we've seen it already.
Yeah.
The technocratic control that they can assert through this COVID business, right? All over the place. Technocratic control. Technocrats say this, and the governors assert dictatorial power, and that's the end of it. Nothing happens until finally people begin to rebel and say, we're just not going to go along with it, right? But it's interesting that the people the rebelling people are just people. Right. It's just an average Joe. It's one of the deplorables or whatever you want to call them. They simply say, well, I'm going to go to the bar. I'm going to go to have a Christmas dinner or whatever it is. They don't see themselves as, when they do that, as exercising some kind of governmental authority. This gets me back to the militia. The militia is a governmental institution. It's people themselves within the government having certain kinds of authority and the ability to exercise it. And it's Nancy Reagan. The ultimate concept is Nancy Reagan's principle: just say no. You have tyrants attempting to assert powers they don't have. The people themselves just say no, and they say that with governmental authority because they're in this. They don't even need, people say, well, the militia, it's guns. You don't even need to assert that kind of authority of force. It's the authority of saying, this governmental entity is not going along with you. Oh, you're going to send a writ from some court? We're not going along with that either. We're simply going to do this. And there were too many of us for you to stop us.
That's exactly what it boils down to. If there's anything collective that we need to do in this country, it's grow a collective backbone and people to actually stand up and do what they know is right, what they know is constitutional, and do it in large enough numbers that they can't do anything about it.
And what I tend to focus on is you have to do it with governmental authority. A bunch of people getting together, marching in the streets, it's the First Amendment, right? You're exercising this protest authority, protest power, a personal right, your individual right to go out and protest, right? You've got a bunch of people exercising it, but you have no governmental authority. The most that you're doing is, quote unquote, petitioning the government for redress of grievances. We're marching out here so that you, our overlords, will realize we're unhappy, and please do something to help us.
All right.
Now, if you have a militia structure, just say no. They say, well, we're not coming out to do these various things that you want us to do. We're going to boycott this and boycott that, and we're not going to arrest people because we have the police power on it. We are the police. right? That's what I told you earlier. You get rid of all police functions and you put them in the militia. We don't want separate police, standing armies, little standing armies, right? We want this function within the militia. And at that point, the militia say, well, we're not going to enforce these dictates of yours. Try to get them enforced without us. We're the enforcement mechanism. Now, that changes the whole dynamic of the situation.
Absolutely. That was the brilliance of the founding fathers, is that they recognized the individual is the focus of good government, the rights of individuals. And when you get the lower down the ladder, the closer to the individual people the government is, the more powerful it should be, because then you've got real, honest to God, local government.
Well, that's where government's supposed to come from, right? The people delegate authority to the institution over here, right? And they have always retained the power to alter or amend or abolish. That's the Declaration of Independence. And how do they do that? They do that in their own governmental capacity. They are the ultimate governors of this system. Otherwise, they couldn't delegate governmental power. Think about that for a second, right? They have to have, you can't delegate something you don't have. Okay?
Right.
Well, and they are supposed to retain that at all times. Now, they'll perform certain functions, normal police functions and electoral functions. We talked about that. But the problem becomes, what happens when that long train of abuses and usurpations occurs? When you have that fellow or that woman as the governor, somehow slipped in as the governor, starts acting like a tyrant, and starts giving out governmental decrees from the executive mansion and expects that these are going to be enforced on John Q. Citizen and his wife. The militia comes along as the police organization, police structure, and simply says, well, we've looked at this. And the answer is no. Rewrite it, amend it, rescind it. But we're not doing this. And you have no ability, because the only force that you have to use against us is us.
Right. Okay. Here's what I've seen, and I've talked about it quite often. The real power that they're using against people about this mask stuff is the power of these. I basically call them unconstitutional agencies, such as Department of Health, Department of Licensing, Department of do you own a gerbil? Whatever they came up with.
I don't own. I understand what you mean. I don't own a gerbil, but I can understand.
But I mean, it's they come out and they use the power of these licenses and things like that to shut down a business, threaten people, beat them over the head. And up to this point, all you had to do was pay your $30 licensing fee every year, and they left you alone. But now they're using it as
we're going to get money out of you.
Sumper and Edwin, but the reality of that is that yes, and what it is, it's subtle control, because they won't use it against you until they decide you're an enemy of what they want to accomplish. And when you become a target of their action, then all of a sudden they use all those regulations to destroy you.
But let's look at this. Let's look at this in the same sense that we talked about earlier with the Department of the Interior. Say you have a public health commission, and their responsibility is to go around and make sure that the restaurants are sanitary. There aren't too many rat droppings in the marinara sauce or whatever. Okay. And one would say, all right, on the face of it, let's say that's a legitimate purpose of local government, is to make sure that I'm not being poisoned when I go to, Papa Gino's restaurant. And so the health authorities come by and they say, Papa Gino, we've checked out, and your kitchen is not clean enough. Who's going to enforce that against Papa Gino? The militia, right? We have a separation between this administrative body that's going to promulgate regulations and perhaps ask for investigation, and the body that's actually going to enforce the results of that investigation. So it may be that the reason that Papa Gino's is constantly receiving health department certificates of noncompliance is because Papagino's cousin was involved in a land deal that took a lot of profit away from somebody whose brother-in-law is on the health commission. That's local government.
Yeah.
Right? Local government is, to a large extent, involved in corrupt land deals and back scratching of that kind. And we discovered that's what's actually going on. So, number one, the militia doesn't enforce that order against Papagino's. Number two, they start investigating the health commissioner for corruption. See how that works? Now,
or they find out that the health commissioner wants a little of this. Yeah.
Well, it's his cousin. His cousin's getting the deal, right? His cousin. But that's what we don't have now. We have no ability for these people at the lowest level to turn to somebody else in government and say, please exercise some authority on my behalf. I'm being oppressed by these people in the administrative agency here, in the county, or the city, or the town, or the state, wherever the heck it is. I have no recourse except to go to those people, right? If
And they're
I'm being
corrupt.
oppressed by the health authority of the county, who do I go to? Maybe I go to the county commissioner. Who's the county commissioner in bed with? Right? Maybe it's his brother-in-law that's involved in this land deal that the Board of Health Commissioner is
Probably very likely, too.
Probably very likely, right? So I'm here with a whole group of people, the power of the posse comitatus, the power of the county, right? I don't mean it in the sense of what we think of, but that's what those words mean. The power of the county, it's everyone in the county. All of us, but this very small number of people here, have no governmental authority to check and balance what they're doing to us. How can that possibly be a Republican form of government? Or any acceptable form of government, whatever adjective you want to apply to it? You can't have that. And that's what we've lost. And they took that away in 1903, so-called Dick Act, when they created this dichotomy between the organized militia, the National Guard, and what's called today the unorganized militia. They originally called it the reserve militia. Right? That was done by the same people that gave you the administrative state. And they did it for that reason. They wanted to take away from the average American the ability to exercise governmental power in a governmental institution of his own. He wasn't a county commissioner. He wasn't a state representative. He wasn't a member of Congress. He wasn't a presidential advisor. He was just Joe Dokes. But he was part of this huge organization which exercised the ultimate in political power. The political power talked about in the Declaration of Independence. And he knew it. He knew that he was in an organization with this kind of power, and he knew he could turn to the members of his own local company, or whatever we were going to call it, and he could turn to the members of the battalion and so forth, all of these elements. As soon as the administrative state turned against him improperly. And the administrative state people said, oh, yeah, we can't. One thing we can't do, we can't leave any kind of ultimate political recourse in the hands of these people whom we intend to control. And where is that in our Constitution? Well, the main thing, if you look at the Second Amendment, the free state, we don't want a free state. How do we get rid of that? Oh, we remove the well-regulated militia. That's step number one. Then number two and number three, and eventually we defraud them through the electoral process, and then they're completely in our control. And then we turn the ultimate power over to global institutions, which our elections don't even reach. Our elections just reach these people who are stooges of global institutions. And now we reverse the Declaration of Independence, and we've created some kind of oligarchical slave state, which is the opposite of a free state, I take it, right? What adjective do you put in there? When you take out free, I think a slave is the one you put in. We have created this, and there's nothing they can do about it. Because their representatives are elected by our machines. Their representatives are beholden to our global structures in many ways. And the deplorables have no governmental power except the power of the voters to participate in a fraudulent selection of fraudulent representatives.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And we've destroyed that. Yeah.
And you can trace this right back. I mean, these are all systematic things because power, even if it isn't a conscious conspiracy, power always has to work through a set of steps. All right? So I don't think necessarily the guys who were involved in 1903 are being channeled by Hillary Clinton today, the way she was channeling Eleanor Roosevelt. Right? The people today realize exactly what those people then did. If we want power over this large group of people, we have to remove from the hands of those people the ability to exercise power on their own. And not only to exercise power on their own in the sense of revolutionary power, they rise up in the streets with pitchforks and torches, but to exercise specifically governmental power, right? Because if the people recognize, hey, wait a minute, I'm part of a governmental structure. I have governmental power. I'm in this institution. You guys over there in the zoning board, you're not the ultimate power. And if you show up here with some kind of ukase or dictate, we're gonna channel Nancy Reagan. Just say no. No, just say no. And if we say no, all the people in the county say no, then what are you going to do? Nothing. You're going to have to go back and change that policy that you have. We're simply not going to go along with you.
Right.
All right?
That's why I said to you a little earlier, it's going to take a collective. If we're going to do something collectively, we need to grow a collective spine nationwide to just say no.
Yeah. The people is not a singular term. The people is a collective term.
That's right.
The people are, not the people is. Okay, the people are. And the whole concept of the founding fathers was, what was the foundation of government? The people. It wasn't the king. It wasn't his ministers. It wasn't the corrupt parliament. I mean, the parliament at the time of George III, how were those people like the rotten boroughs, right? People that were elected because they were the local oligarch, right? Totally corrupt.
Well, right now, Edwin, we can't get within 6 feet of each other, and half the people are out there are wearing masks, and if you're not wearing a mask, they give you a 10-foot radius. Part of this whole silliness that we're dealing with right now is to keep people from talking to each other and
exactly
comparing notes and comparing what they know about what they've heard from this person and that person and that. What a perfect way to keep people from learning from their neighbors, being we the people, than what they have set up right now. It's a perfect storm.
Thumper, if it wasn't for programs like this, our radio programs, our podcasts, and now they're trying to shut them down.
Oh yeah, we have this incestuous relationship between the big tech people, the media, and the corrupt political structure. And that, of course, is just as international and global as all these other problems, right?
Even more so.
Yeah, I always look at that big tech thing, and I said years ago, I said, you're being bamboozled here. These people are pretending that they're going to be public forums, public fora. They're pretending that they're going to be open to all viewpoints because they don't want to be subject to defamation, copyright, trademark lawsuits, all right? But what will really happen is once they gain this power, they will use it to censor, all right? Once they gain the technological ability to do it, they will censor because they know it will be difficult for Congress, which is a big committee, to turn around and change the rules. And that's why you see Zuckerberg and the other people going in, and they asked a question about how their operation runs. I don't know what's happening. We don't censor anybody. We don't know. Well, these things kind of just happen. Our algorithms. What are you talking about? Even I watch Facebook sometimes and YouTube, and you see it happening right in front of your eyes. Every time I go to a YouTube, whether it's about the election or not, there's a line at the bottom says the AP has called the election for Joe Biden. Now, what are they trying to do? Brainwash me? I mean, if I see that thing like a dog is Pavlov, if I see that the bell rings enough times, I'm going to believe it? Well, of course, that's what they're doing.
Sure.
Why else is it there? What the AP has done is a vast irrelevance to our system. They may as well ask what the Grand Duchess of Gerolstein says about the election. But why is it there? It's there so that those people whose brains are capable of being easily washed will cycle through 400 or 500 times in a week this message. And if you do that to a dog after a while, it learns to sit, it learns to fetch, it learns to be quiet, right? You can do this with a dog. Can't do it with a cat. I found that out. But you can do it with a dog, right? Very easily. And it usually doesn't take 500 iterations. before the dog learns to sit or not to lie on the couch or whatever it is. So you see, that's how in a sense how trivial this is. It's right in front of your face. You're seeing it happening. And yet they're telling you it doesn't happen.
Right.
Don't believe your lying eyes. Isn't that the song?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. What do you want to believe, me or your lying eyes?
So Congress has to come back at a minimum and say, oh, no, you people, if you want to pull this stunt, you're publishers, and then you're responsible for every letter and word that comes up on your platforms. And you can be sued from now until the end of time. Or even better, let's have socialism. Hey, we're going to have socialism with Biden and Harris. Let's have socialism. Let's nationalize all of these platforms. Let's nationalize Google, Twitter, Facebook, and whatever. And have some kind of independent commission running them the way the FCC was supposed to be running television and radio in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s.
Well,
that didn't work out too well, but that would be a backbreaker for these tech companies.
Well, and I can tell you, Edwin, they are already talking about IT becoming the new norm, so that humans aren't part of the equation anymore. It's artificial intelligence.
I sometimes
AI.
wonder if humans are part of the equation anymore when you look at what goes on. But
yeah. Well, I mean, they're talking artificial intelligence being the one that makes all of our decisions for us, and they're talking openly about doing that now.
Yeah. That makes all of our decisions for us, not their decisions for them.
Right. For us.
We have to be clear on this. They're not going to have robots telling them what to do.
Right. It's going to only be us.
Programmed for us.
Right. It's deplorable robots.
Yeah, the deplorables. Always the deplorables are always the ones that get the benefit of these new programs.
Right.
Okay, they're always thinking of us. That's the problem. They're always thinking of us. Day and night, they're thinking about us.
Literally, yes. Day and
literally.
Night. Yeah, absolutely. Well,
it's the hubris of the thing too, Dan, right? You got these technocrats, and they really think that they know better than anyone else. They can predict all the consequences of their actions, and they're not responsible for any adverse consequences that slipped by their thought process. Like Fauci. Here's Fauci. Oh, we need lockdowns. The economists come out and say, and a lot of public health people come out and say, well, you're going to have these terrifically adverse economic consequences. It's going to lead to depression, suicide, early death, failure to get medical treatment. You're going to kill more people in the long run than are being killed if you just let the virus alone, if you did nothing else. He does it anyway. All right? That's the hubris of this. Now, in Greek tragedy, in Greek theater, hubris always leads to tragedy, right? When the main character is the victim of hubris, he always ends up at the dirty end of the stick. Well, there we are. And it has to come back now. Who's going to correct the situation? Not the establishment, the people themselves. People have to wake up, pay attention, learn something, and then act on it. And that's the hardest part, because I know a lot of people have learned a lot of things that are useful, but they feel there's nothing they can.
They don't act on it.
There's nothing.
And I guess that would be one of maybe the final thing that I'll ask you as a question. I appreciate you staying on with us, but that would be the big question I would ask you. What do you see? How do you see individuals? How do you see us deplorables being individually capable of challenging the system in a way that makes sense? Should we call our senators and our representatives? Should we contact our state legislatures and say, we want a full recount of all these votes? Certainly one thing we need to go back to, but it's too late now, is go back to a strictly paper ballot, and you've got to be there, and you've got to present an ID, and you've got to be identified very positively before you should be given the right to vote. But what can we do now with what we've got?
Well, the first point I think is a good one. If you have a competent and trustworthy representative at whatever level, then you've got to bombard him with requests to take action, whether it's investigatory action, some committee that he has authority over, whether he can put some bill in dealing with the future of electoral systems. Congress has control over that as well as the state, so we can start talking about that. Whether it's demanding that investigations be continued by Congress or state legislatures or commissions or whatever into what happened in this election. Let's find out what went wrong. How are we going to correct it if we don't know what happened, right? And then those who refuse to do this, either because they tell you they won't or because they don't do anything at all, then somehow you've got to make it clear among the people that you know and any political organizations with which you participate that those people have to be removed. Mm-hmm. There are some things that are so important. I don't care whether that guy's for farm subsidies. I live in Iowa. If he's not for this, go. Mm-hmm. Right? Forget it. These things are much more important. What I have been doing for years, and I hope it's not going to be 41 years until people realize that public sector unionism might be a bad idea, is try to get people to realize the necessity, first, of understanding the militia concept in our fundamental documents. Number two, realizing that they have a responsibility now, not mañana, but now, to do something to revitalize these structures because they don't exist properly in any of our states. And number three, there are things that they can do about that. And I've written books about it. All right? We've got to do that. And the difficulty that I have here is, on that subject, is the Second Amendment people who should be behind this in principle, the pro-gun people, the last thing they want to talk about is the militia, because they feel that that word has been so demonized by the media, so corrupted, that as soon as they start talking about it, then people won't listen to them about, the right to keep this gun or that gun or whatever it is they consider to be important to them under the Second Amendment. And that's one of the difficulties. We've got these hurdles in a number of areas where constitutional concepts, constitutional structures have been so neglected, and then in the case of the militia have been so vilified, defamed, that you've got to do a huge educational job just to get back to square one. And that's the one thing I'm doing now, mostly because I'm the only bloody person I know in the country who's doing it. There are plenty of people out there dealing and will deal with electoral fraud. And if I can find the right people who bring a lawsuit, I'll bring a lawsuit in Virginia because I was defrauded. Right? Been defrauded a number of times in Virginia, all the time it's going on. Right? But this is one area where I know that I am basically the only person that's doing this. If I don't write these books, if I don't put stuff out on the internet, if I don't talk to people like you, nobody else is going to do it.
Yeah,
I don't think the founding, they talk about the founding fathers were great geniuses and so forth. Let's not even let it rise to that level. They were people who were highly acute and insightful, and they had spent a lot of time reading history going back to the ancient world, and they understood what individual psychology.
They understood our weaknesses. They understood
and political motivations, right? They understood that. Okay, they understood the concept that very bad things can happen in politics very quickly if checks and balances that actually work are not implemented. That's what we've lost. I think to a large extent we've lost that. The very fact you find these Democrats, they're going to do all this thing. They don't care about checks and balances. They want to remove every check and balance that exists in the constitutional structure. If you're on the other side, if you're a constitutionalist, you ask, let's lay these checks and balances out. Let's look at how this mechanism is supposed to work. Right? We have the key, we have the ignition, we have the gear shift, we have the clutch, and they have to work in a certain sequence. And if we pull one of them this way or that way, we can stop the car from running. We have all sorts of checks and balances built into this machine. What is it in the Constitution? And if you work it down, or actually I work it up, go back to Declaration of Independence, it's the control, the ultimate control of the people over this system. Their ability to intervene at any point in time. And you want them to intervene before things begin to get out of hand. You don't want to get a Declaration of Independence situation where the conflict has reached such a stage that it's irreconcilable differences. You want the control mechanism to come into play before the car gets out of control, if you know what I mean, all right? And that's what we don't have. You look at that whole set, and there's this blank area right in the middle, or maybe it's a little higher than that. Blank area is right up here at the top. the militia structure, the direct participation of the people with governmental authority is not there. Well, would you expect that if a building has 5 fundamental pillars of support the architects put in, and you remove even one of them, and it happens to be the basic one, that the building is not eventually going to come down? Can you look at the Constitution of the United States, Constitution of certainly the first 13 states, those provisions dealing with the militia and connecting it to a free state, and believe that you could take away the militia and keep a free state? Were the founders nuts? Were the founders some kind of fanatics? That's a question I have. Were they so stupid that they actually believed something which isn't true and put it into all of these documents, basic documents of government? Were those the kind of people we're talking about? No,
Certainly
those are the
not.
Democrats. Those are modern Democrats, right?
Yeah.
Those aren't the founding fathers. They're not even Alexander Hamilton. Okay? You cannot run a system contrary to the principles of the system, good or bad. You can't run Stalinism on the basis of the First Amendment. You can't run the U.S. Constitution on the basis of Stalinism. It's really simple. You don't have to go to Harvard Law School. You don't actually have to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, next to Harvard Law School to understand this.
No, that's right.
We've got to get people beyond understanding it to be willing to say, I'm going to move in some way. I'm going to take some action. And I think the ultimate action is to them recognize I'm the government, and I want those institutions in which I, as part of the government, actually exercise authority to be put back into working order. And in Virginia, that's Governor Northam and the people in the Virginia legislature. They're the ones we have to come to because they write those laws. We've got a whole set of so-called military laws in Virginia. That's where this stuff is supposed to go. They have to change it. They'll never change it. Well, actually, they'll never change it anyway. But whoever is the governor and the General Assembly will probably never change it until the localities come to them and say, we have to have this. And the localities, your local county commissioners, they're never going to change their minds until the people in their jurisdictions come to them at those council meetings and say, why is it we don't have this? Why is it we're subject? I mean, here in where I am, Warren County, Virginia, it's a small place. We've got about 35,000 people. There's no militia, obviously. We have a very small CERT team, Citizens Emergency Response Team, something that was created by FEMA, right? Very small number of people. We have a small fire department and rescue department. And, among ourselves, we'll say, if we really had a major incident here, tank cars full of isocyanate going off the rails and those things, we have tank cars going through here all the time, we probably wouldn't be able to solve it. We'd have to call in all sorts of people from outside. We don't have enough of our own, local citizens trained and organized, knowing basically what to do. In fact, there was one day here a couple of years ago when every rescue unit in the county was out on call. If you called 911 and said, I'm having a heart attack, the answer that they would have given you is get yourself to the hospital. We can't deal with you. It'd be 45 minutes before the 911 people get to you. You'll be cold, go to the morgue. You got to get yourself out. Now you think about that. You say, okay, we don't have enough fire and rescue people. Why don't we also have enough militia people who could take someone, have some basic medical, emergency medical, could drive his car over there. The guy's across the street, right? Why is this fellow calling 911 and getting this response? Because we're not properly organized. Well, there you go. And if we're not properly organized in a rural county like this, where most people, I think, are thinking on the same lines, then we're certainly not organized in those in those areas that are controlled by quote unquote liberals who are against any kind of local involvement.
Well,
from the practical level, it doesn't make sense from the practical level.
No, it doesn't. As a matter of fact, what you're saying is we used to have civil society. That's what we called that organization, was what you called a civil society. And that's what they're trying to destroy.
Yeah. And I look at people who want to get some historical perspective on this. There's a book called Defenseless Under the Night. Defenseless Under the Night. So it's on Amazon. And it's a very good historical analysis of what happened at the early days of World War II, when the Roosevelt administration realized that we really didn't have a national civil defense or homeland preparedness, whatever term you want to use, program or system. What was going to happen when millions of Americans were sent overseas to Europe and to Asia and so forth? How are we going to deal with the protection of local communities and defense plants and the beaches and all the rest of this? And so Roosevelt appointed Vieria LaGuardia, congressman, former mayor of New York, and Eleanor Roosevelt to be the two honchos to come up with a plan to deal with this. And the book goes through all the vicissitudes and backdealing and turf fights and failures and this and that and so on. It's all, political history. What's interesting about the book is that the author never reports that anyone involved with that thought about, quote unquote, the militia. Mm-hmm. No one looked into the Constitution and thought about the militia. Interestingly, even the author didn't think about the militia. The author didn't sit back and say, oh, if I were put in this position, I would look at the Constitution of the United States to see if it had some inkling of an answer. Mm-hmm. Oh, what is here? Right here. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's the book. Defense. Very good book because of what it doesn't cover. And what it shows you, these people and others, because they were the first two, and there were others got involved in, high-level people, didn't even think was appropriate to consider. All right? So we're kind of in the same situation. We're defenseless under the night for a number of different reasons. And most of our dangers are actually domestic. They're not the Japanese or the Germans.
Right.
Right? They're domestic. And we're doing essentially the same thing. We're like fish flopping out of water, trying to come up with an ad hoc solution to this and an ad hoc direction to that and what have you, when the real response is to step back and say, isn't there a fundamental failure in our implementation of the constitutional system? Isn't that why we're in this position? Otherwise, you'd have to say, the other conclusion would have to be, well, the constitutional system is a failure.
Which
right?
It isn't. Yeah.
Which it isn't, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one or the other. Either the whole system is a failure, free government has failed, free state has failed, we can't have that, we have to have socialism, or it's the people who have been administering this have failed in one or more ways, but in particular, looking at this institution that's the one that's supposed to perform these quote-unquote homeland security functions, execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. That's a pretty good definition of homeland security, at least at the surface.
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm.
This is nothing new. And I just found that book amazing because the author really does a great job. I mean, it's a fascinating book. He's dealt with all sorts of minutiae and ferreted out all of these things. And even he at the beginning didn't ask the question, well, wait a minute, what would have been the logical way to approach this if you knew nothing? Like LaGuardia and Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, those are two people who knew nothing. Let's be frank about it. Right? They knew nothing. Mm-hmm. So they're thrown into this, and you would have thought that a person would say, oh, I know nothing. Let me look at the body of laws. Maybe the body of laws of this country will give me an idea. And what's the first one I come across? Oh, the Constitution. Oh, it talks about the militia here and here mm-hmm. and here and over here. It connects it to a free. Maybe if I were Eleanor, I would have asked Franklin. I said, Franklin, what is this thing militia that's in the Constitution? And he would have said, well, I don't know. Maybe we need to do some research on that.
And that was only 40 years after the Dick Act.
Yeah, and so you look at that and say, this is something that a blind person would stumble over. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. So and today, as I say, it's really worse because when you mention that word to people, you get either a kind of a look of, I don't understand, I don't know what you're talking about, or you get the mass media response. No, I don't want to talk about that. That's bad. That's mm-hmm. crazy people. All right. And so they've accomplished their end. They've convinced most people, one way or the other, not to pay attention to the very institutional structure that the Constitution itself tells us is necessary to maintain a free state. Mm-hmm. How could you be more successful in subverting a society.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned 9/11, and of course, the Patriot Act was such an important thing because it literally went the exact opposite way. It tried to federalize and did a very good job of creating a national police force instead of local police.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And that's that's 2 steps away from the idea of a militia. In fact, it's more steps than that. It's about as far away as you could get.
Yeah, it's several leaps away.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
That's interesting because when that thing came out, when they had the 9/11 event, I thought to myself, oh, well, now we're going to see the Second Amendment people, the NRA especially. They're not going to be in favor of all of this massive, top-heavy police state operation. And they will come out and say something about the militia favorably. They will come out and say what should have been said in 1940 and 41 when Eleanor Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia were talking about Homeland Security. Well, they didn't. Nothing, zero, crickets, as they say. We heard crickets. And that's how I got started with this. After a while, I looked at this. In fact, I talked to some of these organizations. I said, we have to do this. And I received nothing back from them at all, just dismissal, okay? So I said, well, I have to start writing about it. That's why this is all the stuff you're showing in these books, that's why it's all there. Because when the 9/11 event occurred, the Patriot Act came out, it was obvious the direction that the establishment was going. And I turned around to the people that I thought were the real proponents, at least in principle, of the free state concept, and I discovered, well, no, they weren't. Or at least they weren't sufficiently that they had thought it through to understand what was necessary to accomplish the goal. And so I started on this business.
They were afraid of appearing not to be patriotic because everybody bought into the 9/11 lie.
Well, you can buy into the 9/11 lie and still say that the way to defend the country domestically is by this other institution. We don't need a totalitarian police state to defend us against homegrown terrorists or terrorists that somehow snuck into the country. Who's supposed to execute the laws? I mean, let's look at the words. Isn't that what you're trying to do? Execute the laws against a certain group of people? And maybe they are, in fact, repelling invasions if you're talking about foreign terrorists sneaking into the country. All right? I mean, that's what amazes me. If you simply look at the Constitution, you see these words, do you think they had that meaning? Execute the laws. Oh, my goodness. How broad is that? No, I think what happened with the NRA was because they were not politically involved until the early 1970s. In the 1960s, and I remember this, there was at least one group, I think it was in Montana, Idaho, that called itself the Minutemen. And they were very much against, I think, the Kennedy administration. I think that was what set them off. They thought the Kennedy administration was too left-wing. And they claimed to be a patriotic group and a militia group. So there was this kind of thing floating around in the media back in the 60s. And then you had the Gun Control Act of 1968 that came out as the ultimate result of the assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of the second Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. And the NRA looked at that and said, uh-oh, this is going too far. And so in the early 70s, 2 or 3, I can't remember which year, they set up a unit within the NRA to engage specifically in pro-gun legislative political activism.
The ILA.
The ILA, Institute for Legislative Action, they call it. It still is there, okay. But they were very careful to distance themselves from anything that was connected with the word militia, because there was this background, not that long before, in which radical people had claimed to be militias and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, overthrow the Kennedy administration. I can't remember. There's all sorts of crazy stuff they were saying. So the NRA shied away from that. And they've never returned to it ever since. And they were very good in getting a stable full of intellectuals, college professors and commentators and so forth, to write, in some instances, very high-level articles, and certainly a lot of propaganda, promoting the concept of the individual right to keep and bear arms, the right of you as an individual to have a gun, to protect yourself in your home, or we hope on the streets, against common criminals. That was the limit of the Second Amendment, period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've often said to these people, I said, well, now, if you had an AR-15 and 5,000 rounds of ammunition in your cellar, and you just by yourself, could you forfend, could you stop a tyranny? Of course not. Mm-hmm. It's a collective effort. It has zero to do, ultimately, with your individual right to have a gun. All right? Obviously, in the collective, you would have not only a right to have a gun, you would have a duty to have a gun. That was the essence of the militia. This was a duty you had and still do. All right? Because you're a part of this society, and you can't maintain a free society unless everybody fights for it in some way. All right? So this whole individual concept is not only disconnected from the militia, but it's extraordinarily dangerous because it tells people you can do this on your own, which is not true. Right? So I've been fighting with these.
Well, you can only do it. Edwin, let's clarify that. They tell you that you can only do it on your own. You can't do it as a group.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes they shy away from it entirely. They don't speak about it at all. Other times they try to distance themselves from the word. The NRA is very clear that it's just silence. You'll hear nothing one way or the other from them. They don't want to be connected with the word. So dangerous. They think it's so toxic. You've got some people who are Second Amendment people who say, what I think you said at the beginning of the program when we started talking about this, well, we're all the militia. Yeah, in a sense, that's true. But it's only true in the militia sense of the word, the constitutional sense of the word, is if we are all organized in certain kinds of institutions that have governmental authority. The fact that we're all out there like a loose bunch of people and we're wearing some T-shirt that says, I am the militia, is meaningless.
Right.
Okay? So this was the experience I had. I can understand why they did it. And I thought that when the 9/11 event occurred and the Patriot Act and all the rest of that,
there'd be some pushback.
Yeah. They'd say, wait a minute, this isn't right. They'd think back to the situation in the 1940s and say, wait a minute, we already went through this once. And we didn't correct the situation. Maybe we should change our approach. And they never have. And so it's interesting, what's happened to the NRA, they found the political structure, the Democrats at least, attacking them in every way, shape, and form. And of course, the media savaging them in every opportunity. So their ability even to effectuate, their political program, I noticed it this year. And a number of people have commented on this, that they were very much less aggressive, let's put it that way, because they used to be pretty aggressive in promoting candidates. They were much less aggressive this year. And did that maybe happen with what the investigations that are going on in New York, the attempt to remove their tax-exempt status, the internal struggles in the NRA over, too much expenditures for salaries and whatever? Right? And of course, who has been promoting that? Well, it's the people that want to destroy them.
Sure.
Obviously, see? So they put themselves in this impossible position that the people who want to destroy them are the same people who don't want us to have a militia for obvious reasons, and the NRA is afraid to get into the fight for the revitalization of the militia. I mean, this is ironic, but it's true.
Well, and the thing is it always goes back to the same thing, a lack of backbone.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that's the one thing that I have a certain amount of hope with Trump, is that over his lifetime, at least what I've been able to discern, he is not the kind of person that has run away from a fight like a dog with his tail between his legs. He has the right attitude.
That's one reason why people like him so well.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, but he needs the help of a lot of advisors that have more knowledge than he does,
and that are loyal.
This is the problem,
and
Yeah,
that are loyal
yeah,
to
the
him.
problem is,
Yeah.
I think of this in terms of the expert witnesses I told you in the past. When I used expert witnesses, I realized that I had to have a pretty good background in that subject before I could even decide which ones to talk to. And then I had to study very carefully what they were telling me so that I was sure that they were propounding something that I could lay out in court and was going to be completely effective for my clients. And that's the difficulty. Trump is not in the position where he can really vet these legal theories, criminal, civil, whatever they are. He has to depend upon some advisors. And the question is, because I don't know the people personally, what kind of advice have they been giving him?
Yeah, yeah. Obviously not as good as they maybe should have.
Well, certainly not as aggressive as he is as a personality.
Yeah.
Okay. They haven't tailored the advice to the person. Just what I said earlier, him coming on doing the Franklin Roosevelt radio fireside chat. And I'm not talking about tweets, which are what, 24 words or something, whatever the heck it is. I'm not talking about that kind of nonsense.
Right.
He's on for 30 minutes, and then he's on again for 30 minutes, and then he's on again for 30 minutes, and he's laying this out in a way that, as much as possible, he can get around or force the media to cover in some sense. So he takes the initiative in his hands.
I think he could probably do that by declaring a national emergency, couldn't he? Just say, this is a national emergency. We are losing. Yeah, they're required to.
They are required to show it. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, that gets back to the question of what's the Chinese involvement in this? What's the Cuban involvement? All right. Do we have foreign powers somehow manipulating our electoral system? If that's the allegation, and there's serious affidavits or whatever, evidentiary material supporting it, then there's no question he can come on and say, we've got a national emergency. There's a possibility our elections have been subverted by communist China. And I'm going to tell you about it, ladies and gentlemen.
I frankly, Edwin, I don't think he's got anything to lose. I think he's got everything to gain. And at this point, I don't think he has anything to lose.
Well, I shouldn't say think about it. You are thinking about it. But I mean, the average person, think about what would he have to lose?
Right.
What more could happen to him than losing the election because all of this fraud business is swept under the rug and we don't ever get a resolution of it? That's essentially the worst thing that could happen. And then the follow-on to that, which is the possibility that the Biden-Harris administration will go after him for civil or criminal cases, tax cases, whatever, the things that they've been saying about him in New York. The AOC threat that he's going to be on some kind of a list and there's going to be retaliation. And of course, if you look at that, that could happen to him. So he has a lot to lose.
Well, except that
leaving office.
Except for, I think he's a strong enough personality. He recognizes, I certainly do, if they take your liberty and they try to turn you into a slave, sometimes it's better to be dead than alive.
Oh yeah. Well, let's not hope we don't have to get to that point. But
well, I hope not too. But but in
terms of what he can do now,
he
has this amazing platform to communicate directly with the people. He has a slate of powers he certainly hasn't exercised, whether he's thought about them or not. He has the ability even to go into the civil courts under his own name and bring high-profile lawsuits, which would go on for years. Nothing stops him from doing that, except perhaps some advisor telling him, well, that may not be a good idea. Right? Who is it that's telling him that? I don't know if he's being told. But just looking at it from the point of view of the position he's in, on the one hand, he has an extreme danger to himself, the loss of the election and what might follow. On the other hand, he has presidential powers that haven't been used. And I'll tell you one thing, if he used some of those powers and the Democrats were to run to some district court in Gizmo City, Montana, and get an injunction, the response would be, if I were president, to the judge, you enforce it if you can. All right? I would give them Andy Jackson's response. I would give them Abraham Lincoln's response. You do not have the authority as a court to interfere with the exercise of my constitutional powers, period. I'm executing the laws pursuant to the Constitution. I'm using these statutes, which have been granted to me by the Congress and the court decisions that say I have discretion. And that's it. That's it. And let the devil take the hindmost.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think there's a point now, we are at a point in our history right now that what we do in the next couple of months is going to make all the difference whether we survive as a constitutional republic. And we better do what we've got to do.
Yeah, this is worse than a Pearl Harbor event.
Oh, way worse.
Because granted, the Japanese won this Pyrrhic victory, but there was no way they could win the war. All right.
Well, and they say the same thing with, they say, well, what about the Civil War? The Civil War is as bad and as bloody as it was. Both sides of that conflict understood the Constitution. And they didn't want to be under communism.
That's right. And
yeah.
So I'm just looking at this and saying, okay, we're going to take a big hit, but we took a big hit in the beginning of World War II, and we came back from it. This is much different. The big hit you're going to have here will not just take out Pearl Harbor; it will take out all the institutions of government. Because once they've established the proposition that fraudulent elections cannot be overturned, what's left?
That's right.
That's the extraordinary nature of this. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who look at this and say, well, what's new? We've had fraudulent elections before, right? We go back in history of...
Not like this. Yeah.
Well, I know not like this, but they don't see it at that level, at that critical level. They say, well, this is just another fraudulent election. Maybe it's a bigger one, but it's just another fraudulent. We've lived through the ones in the past, and we can live through this one. The answer is no, because the people who are coming in, supposedly, the Biden-Harris bunch, intend to make fundamental changes in this structure, governmental structure, besides allowing this kind of electoral activity to go on. They're not going to look into this and correct it. They're not going to return to paper ballots given only to people who will sign the registration form when they walk in with a signature that matches their original registration or their driver's license or whatever it is, verified signatures, verified address. They're not going to go back to that, but especially the imagination. They're going to expand on the mail-in concept.
Right.
Maybe they can be mailing in ballots from Mexico next.
Exactly.
All right, why not? If we're in a global system, the Mexicans have as much interest as in who's the president of the United States as anybody else. Maybe more. They're on our border.
All right, and so why not Canada? Why not Venezuela?
Well, I think I might go for Mexico before Canada, but in any event, you get the picture. That's right.
Yeah, I can get exactly what you're saying.
Why not? Okay, and the answer is, well, there's no reason why not if you accept what they're doing now.
Right.
At least there's no principled reason why not. I mean, the reason might be, well, if you didn't do this, the Democrats wouldn't get as many votes. That's not a principled reason, right? The reason that I'm against not looking into this, not because it's Mr. Trump.
Okay? Right. It could destroy our whole system of government.
That's right. It could be a stuffed rhinoceros in his position. But I still want to look into it because of the consequences to the system of government and then to our entire society going forward. And I'm an old person, I'm one of the deplorables who's in the category that, well, who's the guy that Biden wants to put in, the ethicist who said, well, no one should live past 75. Okay, well, I'm one of those people he wants to get rid of. Biden is over 75, so I wonder if Biden has thought that one through. But he wants to get rid of me. I'm in that category. I'm not going to live that long, all right? I may not see the full introduction of neo-Bolshevism in our country. But I've seen enough of it not to want to let that plague continue for all my grandchildren.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
I got a question for you, Edwin. If you had a platform like Patriot Soapbox, would you do like a 1-week show?
Well, I've had a lot of bad experiences in life, all right? So
Well,
I can
hopefully
talk- I
this
can talk
isn't
about
one
that.
of them.
No. I mean, these things I've been talking about, this, that, and the other thing I've been through, right? And to tell you the truth, I'm too old to give a tinker's damn anymore.
I
I
am
don't
too.
care what people think about me. I don't care what they say about me. They can take shots at me. They're thinking I'm a deer, right? Whatever they want to do. It's too late now.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone beyond my use-by date.
Mm-hmm. I'm in the same boat. I couldn't agree with you more.
That's
Yeah.
right. The
There's a
only thing
certain
I have,
point.
the only
That's
thing
the
I
good
have-
thing about getting old is that as you get old, you don't give a damn anymore.
Yeah, we don't care. The only thing I have in mind now is to try and do something to at least retard what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll be able to turn around, but at least retard it and leave in somebody else's hands the knowledge and the responsibility to finish the job.
Mm-hmm.
Period. It's not going to happen in my lifetime.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've been watching our numbers all afternoon, and we've been going for almost 4 hours now. And the comments in the chat, you are making an impact, my friend. You are definitely making an impact out
Well,
there.
that means somebody's going to mistake me for a deer day after tomorrow.
We've
Hunting
all
season's over.
No, not here. It isn't.
Oh, isn't it?
No.
It ends this weekend here. So.
No, there are people out in the woods, and then it's the muzzle loading season, the late muzzle loading season. Oh, they could be shooting at me for who knows how long.
So I understand you said you're in Warren County.
Warren County, Virginia.
Yeah, that's
Right.
just east of Prince William County, right? Or west.
Oh no, we're essentially as far out. Well, there's one county. We're at the far western part of Virginia.
Okay.
Right on the edge of the Blue Ridge. Yeah.
Yeah, we're in Front Royal, which is the top of the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, the Blue Ridge.
Yeah.
And
Well,
we're probably, I don't know, 10 minutes drive, 15 minutes drive from the West Virginia border if you went in a straight line.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Well,
there are people around here talking about having our area of Virginia secede and join West Virginia.
Yeah. Reverse the Civil War.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well,
No, we'll leave Eastern Virginia.
Yeah.
There'll be an Eastern Virginia, and then there'll be a Middle Virginia of the less radicals, and then there'll be West Virginia, which will include the western part of Virginia today and West Virginia that now exists.
well,
Richmond can do whatever it wants.
I used to run the Navy recruiting office in Manassas, so.
I used to live in Manassas.
There you go.
Yeah, and then it became more like Fairfax, and I hightailed it out of there.
I actually started at the Fairfax recruiting office, and then got assigned as the recruiter in charge at Manassas. So, but my area was all the way out, way west, out there, and it was fun.
Front Royal is one of my favorite places when I was living out there. I lived out in Alexandria when I was stationed at Fort McNair and Fort Myer. So, I'm very familiar with Front Royal. I love the area, beautiful area. Matter of fact, I used to go up there camping on the weekends quite a bit up in the Blue Ridge right there.
Oh, it's beautiful country all year round.
Lovely.
All year round. But now it's hunting season, and just don't make suggestions to people out there.
Well, I have to tell you, Edwin, it's always such a pleasure because you've become a good friend over the years.
I'm glad to hear that, Dan.
I've had the chance to work with you when we tried to do the Sound Money Bill, 11, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Here in Montana, we've covered a lot of trails together.
And they'll be calling us visionaries 20 years from now, 41 years from now. They'll say, that Happel guy really knew what he was talking about. We should have listened to him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have to tell you, my wife actually is doing that now, and that's really quite a step in the right direction.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You become a prophet in your
Only
own
took
home.
30 years. It only took 30 years, but she took a red pill this year, and we're really enjoying it.
Yeah.
So
As long as they eventually come around, it's fine.
Yeah, that's it. Well, Edwin, thank you for a very, very good, and it has been 4 hours now, but it's always a pleasure. It's like sitting in a living room talking to a good friend, and I appreciate that.
And none of us had a mask.
We didn't.
Isn't that
Yeah.
amazing?
Yeah.
What's that a mask?
Yeah.
Just say no.
Just say no.
Just
You're
say no.
absolutely right.
Just say no.
Well,
All right, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, and we'll be back in touch soon.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
And,
All right.
and Edwin,
Thank you.
if you're going to want a copy of the today's show, it'll come in 2 parts: the first hour and the first 2 hours, and the second 2 hours. But we'll get a link out there to you, so if you've got any reason you want to have that a copy of the show, we'll get it to you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
wonderful.
You feed my narcissism.
There you go.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Edwin.
you. All right. Well, it looks like Alan's about ready to take over. So,
Gentlemen, good evening.
I'm ready to just hand it over to Alan and go fix dinner.
yeah. Well,
Yummy.
I hear my wife down there rattling pans. I know for a fact that she thought I should have eaten about an hour ago. So, Alan, you have a wonderful show. I'm glad we had a great conversation. Wishing us happy Thanksgiving. I hope you had the same.
Absolutely. Good to see everybody. That gentleman seemed like a really nice person to chat with.
Oh boy, I'll tell you what, there is a mind that certainly hasn't been wasted. That's Dr. Edwin Vieira, and he is, I think, probably the finest constitutional attorney in the country.
Where'd you go, Alan? We can't hear you. Where'd you go?
Well, I have to tell you, Thumper, that was a shameless attempt to try to get Edwin to take a radio spot.
Why not? I mean, gosh, the amount of his background, his education, and his
it's incredible. Yeah,
absolutely incredible. And he's got the Patriot soapbox mindset.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
got something to say, and he just needs a place to say it.
Well, and the thing is, you haven't even talked to him about sound money, but honestly, he was the architect of the sound money bill that we had here in Montana in 2008 or 2009.
Nice.
And he and Dr. Larry Parks and
Hey, Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you hear me now?
Yeah, we've got you. All right, I'm going to get off of here. So
No, you can finish in a minute. But Pam, before you go, would you record me?
Yeah, you're already set. You're good to go.
So I'm recording?
No, you got, okay, yeah, you hit the button. You're good.
Excellent. Thank you. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. And I'm going to go have dinner. Thumper and I are going to go have dinner. So
Okay,
There you go, guys.
just Thumper, come back in about an hour, will you?
All right, I'll be listening, but I'm going to be in the other room for a little bit.
Oh, you're going to miss out on a wonderful program here.
I'll be listening.
we'll keep
Okay.
listening.
I mean,
Yeah, because
is this narcissistic side of you that I have to be watching you?
no, it's just fear. It's not narcissism. And by the way, you don't get to use the guy's word within 5 minutes of him using it. And I don't know what is going on with my tech. Now my camera is a little fuzzy.
You got up close to it in the automatic feature.
Oh, no, I don't want to get I don't want to get close to it. Okay. Welcome everyone. Alan Myers here. This is For the Republic. Today, I am so happy to have my friend and media personality out there, John Age, and he's going to get to introduce himself in a moment. John, we were going to do Wackadoodle News first, but because Wackadoodle News plays into what we're talking about, I want to let me see, hold on a second here. I got stuff happening. Oh, good. Okay, I don't need that. I want to do the Woman of the Revolution section. I'm going to talk about her, and then I'd like you to give me your thoughts on this. As an educator at the college level, maybe you've heard of her. I never heard. Her name is, and I'm going to probably butcher her last name, so I apologize up front, Lydia Barrington Dara. I'm just going to call her Lydia, but that's who it is. In a nutshell, she became a spy. And her spying helped a very famous general at a very necessary time. She was actually born in Dublin in 1729, got married, moved to the colonies in 1755, Pennsylvania specifically, because they have Philadelphia, because they have a big Quaker community. Being a Quaker, I didn't know it, but Quakers are pacifists. They don't want to get involved. They, hands off. Apparently, Lydia didn't get that memo. When they moved to Philadelphia, her husband, William, a tutor, she was a midwife,